But now on BBC Radio 4 Profile. The news of the world rarely seems to be out of the headlines these days, from the antics of their fake shake reporter to this week's allegations of royal phone tapping. Nick Hyam profiles the News of the World editor, Andy Coulson.
It's been a bad fortnight for the News of the World. On Friday, its royal editor was charged with eavesdropping on voicemail messages. A week earlier, it lost the libel trial of the year. The maverick Scottish politician Tommy Sheridan defended himself in court with the aid of his glamorous wife against allegations of serial adultery and lurid sex romps. He won and turned on his tormentors.
The standard of journalism that the News of the World represents was on trial in Scotland for 5 weeks, and fortunately the jury found him guilty of dragging journalism into the sewer.
And if that's the News of the World, what about its editor, Andy Coulson? He must be a monster, surely. Well, apparently not.
He was a nice guy, and it's fair to say he gives proof to the fact that you don't have to be ruthless to get to the top. Nice guys do make it, and Andy is one of those.
That was Peter Owen, Andy Coulson's first boss, the deputy editor on a local newspaper, who took him on as a promising youngster straight from school. Years later, Coulson himself, by then at The Sun, went on the children's show Live and Kicking to offer some advice on how to get a job in journalism.
My top tip if you want to become a national newspaper journalist really is to get interested in the news, to read the newspapers and to get in touch with your local paper.
And that's exactly what Andy did, starting his career as a junior reporter for the Basildon Evening Echo when he was just 18.
Get in touch with the editor of your local paper, ask to go in on your school holidays and see if you can get a story. That's the best thing.
Where do you get your stories from, first of all? What are your sources, generally?
It's all about contacts, really. It's making sure that you talk to the right people and that you're in the right place at the right time.
Right.
And really just, about developing relationships with people where they're going to want to give you stories.
Excellent. I mean, is there a lot of competition, perhaps, let's say, between the other tabloids for getting the story first?
Yeah, there's fierce competition, but we don't need to worry about that too much because we're so far ahead of the rest.
Oh!
The young Coulson was an Essex lad. He turned up for his job interview in Basildon wearing white socks. They sent the cub reporter off on a training course, where Sylvia Bennett taught him shorthand. He wasn't interested in the academic side of the course, and not terribly interested in shorthand. What he really excelled at was getting stories.
Reading his last assessment this morning, it actually says, Andy's desperately keen to succeed. He's never been afraid to ask for advice and has worked hard to produce some good stories from his district. He has a good nose for stories and is in his element when hunting around and chasing them up. So I think you can see that even his journalism tutors felt that there was something there was a spark there. He was obviously going to go far.
Plenty of young reporters are driven by a hunger for stories. Andy Coulson had something extra. Peter Owen thinks it was his charm.
He was a competent reporter, but a chap who could get in. It's all very well being a doorstepping reporter who can worm their way into a place and get an interview that others can't. Often that can be done by the hard nuts, but you have to be persuasive and gentle and not a bad guy to get in and do that, and Andy was all of those things.
Young Coulson was clearly more of a tabloid Tintin than a red-top Rottweiler. He was also shrewd enough, or lucky enough, to be interested in gossip. As the tide of showbiz and celebrity journalism swelled, Andy Coulson's career rose with it. He'd started a gossip page on the Evening Echo. Soon he was working shifts at The Sun in Fleet Street. When he got a permanent job, it was on the paper's showbiz column, Bizarre, where he became famous, if not notorious, for charming stars into letting him be photographed with them. He moved to the News of the World and became editor 3.5 years ago. But he cuts rather an unlikely figure. Ian Reeves is editor of the journalist's trade paper, Press Gazette.
If you were casting a movie about a Fleet Street tabloid newspaper, he wouldn't even make it past the first audition for the editor's role. He's a very, unassuming-looking guy, very quietly spoken, thoughtful individual, which is a long way from most people's stereotypical idea of the hard-drinking, fast-talking, swearing, sort of whirlwind that was the role of some previous editors.
His early showbiz experience served him well.
A big part of his earlier career was on the showbiz desks. That part of journalism, people think it's easier than it is, and in order to get your way into sort of the inside track on what can be a very shallow world, you need to have that kind of charm and that personality to kind of do the rounds at the parties and to grin and bear it when the PRs are being horrific, and to pretend you love the latest album or whatever it might be. And he was very successful. He was one of the big the great successes on the Bizarre column. A lot of what the News of the World does is very revelatory, dirt digging, lifting lids which people would prefer remain firmly in place, and often with senior and powerful people too. And yet those are people he might have to have a relationship with and go back to for other stories, to get on side for campaigns and that sort of thing. So it does require a particular kind of diplomacy to succeed at that.
The charm and diplomacy can be lethal. One publicist reputedly said of him, he could screw you over and make you feel good about it. He still works hard at being Mr. Nice Guy. Peter Owen of the Basildon Evening Echo again.
On the day that he was appointed News of the World editor, he rang me at home and said, "Thanks a lot, I owe it to you." And that summed up what Andy Coulson is, just a nice guy.
His staff at the News of the World describe someone who's driven, determined and very clever. Stuart Kuttner is the paper's managing editor.
Andy Coulson is a focused, resilient, determined, enormously hard-working, committed journalist, and leads a team who I think, are equally inspired as he is. And I think, editors have two principal objectives. One is to make a success of their newspapers in terms of circulation figures, to work as hard as possible to drive sale, and equally to set a news agenda. And I think the News of the World under Andy has been doing that with some success.
To begin with, indeed, Andy Coulson was highly successful as an editor. Under his leadership, the paper enjoyed a series of scoops. One of the earliest was the front-page splash about a plot to kidnap Victoria Beckham, uncovered by the paper's investigations editor, Mazza Mahmood. Later, the plot turned out to be a fiction, but at the time, Andy Coulson himself went on the radio to crow about the story.
Andy, how do you tell somebody like Victoria Beckham that she's in huge danger and is about to be kidnapped?
It wasn't an easy conversation. She took it very well. She was obviously very shocked and wanted to know the full detail. We were able to give her that, as of course were the police. But once she'd spoken to the police, once we've been able to tell her that these guys were now in custody, I think it was just enormous relief, really. And also, not wishing to blow the paper's trumpet, but certainly I think Maz's trumpet should be blown here. She was incredibly grateful for what he'd managed to do.
It was a rare interview. As one former tabloid editor said, Coulson has worked hard to cultivate a low profile. He's one of those editors who does prefer to let his paper blow its own trumpet, and there's been plenty to sound off about. David Beckham's affair with Rebecca Luce, Sven-Göran Eriksson making unguarded remarks to Mazza Mahmood, dressed up at the time in his familiar guise as a fake sheikh, the revelation of Mark Oaten's affair with a rent boy, which put paid to Oaten's bid for the Liberal Democrat leadership. Coulson proved brilliant at deal-making and schmoozing, deploying the skills he'd learnt from years of dealing with celebrity publicists. Some unkind souls suggested too many of the paper's stories came from the most celebrated publicist of all, Max Clifford. But even if they once did, they don't anymore. Clifford and Coulson have fallen out, after Coulson ran a story Clifford didn't care for about one of his clients.
And normally in a situation like that, I mean, over the last 20, 30 years, I've fallen out with lots of editors from time to time. But normally, a week or two later, okay, move on. We've had lots of results, lots of victories, if you like. But with Andy, it was a bit more personal than that. When I called him to say, okay, it's happened, we've disagreed, move on, there was no response. Fine. So I accept that.
Clifford accuses Coulson of behaving childishly.
Obviously, he decided the minuses outweighed the pluses. I just think that when you're editor of a national newspaper, particularly a Sunday newspaper, and someone comes up with as many major stories as I do, it's best to work together when you can. So to shut that door, from purely a business point of view, to me, wasn't a very mature decision.
At the News of the World, they like to say they get their stories through old-fashioned journalism, but the chequebook plays an important part as well. That much is clear from the paper's website.
Have you got a hot story or an amazing picture? We pay big cash for big stories and top pictures. Call our confidential news desk hotline, free on 0800 279...
But despite the past successes, the last few weeks have been pretty dreadful ones for Andy Coulson and the News of the World.
3 men have been arrested for allegedly intercepting phone calls from staff at Clarence House, the London residence of the Prince of Wales. The News of the World has confirmed that its royal editor is one of the men detained.
3 men accused of trying to buy radioactive material for use by terrorists in a so-called dirty bomb have been cleared at the Old Bailey. Lawyers for the men, who are all from northwest London, argued that they'd been entrapped by an undercover investigation staged by a News of the World reporter, Mazza Mahmood, who's known as the fake...
The socialist politician Tommy Sheridan has won his libel action against the News of the World and has been awarded one of the biggest compensation payouts in Scottish legal history.
These stories have resurrected familiar complaints about the News of the World and the other red-top tabloids. They're prurient and intrusive. They're less concerned with the public interest than with titillating stories that interest the public. They're prepared to go to any lengths to ferret out information and trap their victims. Sometimes they just make things up. The red tops usually deny the charges and close ranks in response. Tabloid writers and editors we approached for this programme preferred not to be interviewed. Critics are dismissed as snooty and sneering, middle-class types who don't understand popular taste. We have nothing to be ashamed of, they declare. The News of the World is one of the most self-confident. Ian Reeves of Press Gazette.
There is something also about the News of the World as a newspaper and as an organisation which seems to inspire the people who end up there. It's described as almost like a cult by some people, and any cult has to have a leader which is who's considered charismatic and has those kind of attributes which inspire people to go to ever greater heights for you.
Of course, one characteristic of cults is not just the pressure to deliver results, but the pressure to conform. Breaking ranks is discouraged. Despite the scoops, circulation at the News of the World has been falling. The month Andy Coulson took over, it sold almost 4 million copies a week. Last month, it sold fewer than 3.5 million. The consolation is that its competitors, the Sunday Mirror and the People, aren't doing any better. Andy Coulson's future as the paper's editor is in the hands of its proprietor, Rupert Murdoch. Max Clifford again.
In terms of his future, there's only one person that matters, and that's Rupert Murdoch. And Rupert is totally his own man. He won't be remotely interested in what anybody else thinks. If, in his judgment, Andy Coulson has done a good job for the News of the World overall, then his future is still as bright. If he changes his mind, and he doesn't, and he can change his mind very quickly, then that's a whole different ballgame.
While his newspaper may be under attack for its reporting methods and the quality of its journalism, it's hard to find anyone with a bad word to say on the record about Andy Coulson himself. He's a family man with 2 young sons, a fanatical supporter of Tottenham Hotspur, who works hard, plays hard, believes passionately in what he does, and attracts fierce loyalty from his staff. But as his first mentor Peter Owen points out, he's also a leading figure in a ruthlessly competitive industry.
There is no doubt, of course, with falling circulations throughout national newspapers, particularly the red tops, they are fighting tooth and nail to get the stories by hook or by crook. I don't see the crook side of it sitting very neatly onto Andy's shoulders. I don't want to eulogise him and put him make him an angel. He ain't. He's like the rest of us, hard bitten perhaps and determined to get the best story. But to get it in an underhanded way wouldn't have thought to been Andy's style.
Profile was presented by Nick Hyam. The producer was Leslie Taylor.